along the spectrum of trouble. And I was firm and set as this week began. I was working on a series, and we were going to start it off today, and I was praying over this, thinking on these things, and working through the first one of them, and God did not seem to want it this week. And I kept getting drawn into some other things that made me just kind of think of this, is we need a moment to take a break. Which I think we all recognize that. We are, by the way, in a Seventh-day Adventist church, that implies with that, there's the sense of we value this day of taking a breather. Can you breathe with me for just a second? Just a nice deep one. Have you done that this week? I needed it just now, and I didn't realize it. So I'm going to do something slightly different with my time today, and I'm going to tell you a story. Just a nice story. It was raining yesterday. I don't know about you. Those are the times in which I just like to hunker down. I really like weather, as long as it's outside. Except for the snow. I'm living in a world of sin, and snow comes with it, I suppose. Anyway. Some of you, it's so nice. Yeah. I'm not going to argue with you from up here, where I stand in authority, and you, of course, are down there. But I'll tell you a story and interject as we go throughout some valuable lessons I think that it brings up in themes. We're going to talk about some more stories later on throughout this month, the next couple of weeks, but this is one I just really enjoy it. And I can't say why I ever have one of those books that you just want to read again and again and again, and you come back to it every now and again. This is one of them for me. And I'll give you little bits and pieces of it. And so we're going to talk about today, we're going to talk about Jesus, as always, because that is the thing we come to celebrate and worship. But also we're going to talk a lot about elephants. Yeah, it took a second for you to realize what I'm saying. Elephants, yes, the world's largest land mammal, the thing with the long nose. That is what we're talking about. By the way, cannot jump. Fun fact. So this happened a long time ago. Must have been probably the 1990s. Some of you, that doesn't seem like a long time ago. It should. And we're going to be in Zululand, South Africa. So late 90s, early 2000s, that's around when this occurs. And a man named Lawrence is sitting in his office. He runs and owns a large game preserve called Tula Tula. And that is a place where it is essentially like we have national parks. For them, it is a privately owned national park. So people come in. And at Lawrence's park, there are all sorts of the quintessential African animals. You could come and you could see at Tula Tula, you could see beautiful gazelles and zebra, wildebeest, crocodiles, hippo, all different sorts of things, but there were no elephants at this time. It's fenced in around the sides to keep out poachers mainly, which had been a perpetual problem at these sorts of places. Either you had somebody who was part of a larger criminal syndicate that really likes to harvest these different sorts of rare animals, and it's very problematic in our world, or you have somebody who is unfortunately so poor that they steal the animals from the park in order to feed people, and they try to balance these things out. It's always work for him. You had to keep the water running. You had to ensure the animals were doing well. You had to check fence lines. You had to run the various staff and guards and lodges and those sorts of things that were going on. And as he's sitting at his desk, his phone rings, not uncommon. He picks up, and it was a woman from an organization called EMOA. That's EMOA, EMOA, which stands for the Elephant Managers and Owners Association. So an association of various people who work and live throughout Africa who have elephants living on their game preserves as part of the business. And her name was Marion, And he knew her from various things as being a conservationist and a naturalist. He had learned about these various organizations and working with people, but couldn't imagine why she would be calling him. He didn't own elephants. He didn't manage elephants in Tula Tula. And she proceeded to tell him, Lawrence, there is a herd of elephants that needs a home. And we have heard about your work, and we've seen the way you run your beautiful park, and we would like for you to take these elephants. He said, we cannot afford that, essentially because an individual elephant at this time probably would have cost them over $10,000. A herd, of course, is more than one elephant. And I just told her, I can't afford to get those. We've always wanted some jumbos here roaming around. People would really come in more to see these sorts of things. It would really help business for them, but he could not possibly afford them. She said, no, we will give them to you. All you have to do is pay the transport cost to bring them over. At this time, there had just recently been a trailer invented large enough to transport elephants, plural. Wonderful. A free group of elephants. All he was going to have to do was pay transport and, of course, electrify the fencing around, which, if you're thinking that this is just a small park of a few acres, elephants should not be existing in spaces of the size of which our property is on. They need big spaces. These are wild animals, so they need big spaces, and Tula Tula was enormous. So getting a wire wrapped around this that would have a very high voltage, not enough that if you were to grab it would kill you, but it would make you feel the urge to sit down immediately. High voltage. She said, here's the problem, Lawrence. These elephants have gained a reputation for escaping. They've been busting through fences and causing damage to various things at the park. She says, they're problem. They're going to cause an issue. She says, but the only alternative, it's either you or somebody's going to come here and shoot them. That was the alternative for these animals. Elephants, of course, beautiful, wonderful animals, highly intelligent. And Lawrence loved animals. That's why he dedicated his life to these sorts of things. And to hear this, he thought and told them he would have to talk about it with his staff and those sorts of things, and hung up, walked to where his head ranger was and says, do you know that we have elephants now? An interesting discussion. Not the way I would do it. We're going to get some. And they're coming here because to him it was that, sure, it was going to represent sacrifice for him, but the alternative for these things was going to be death. Does that sound familiar? Troublesome beings that have gotten themselves into a real mess. The only alternative for them is either rescue by someone else or destruction. Isn't that just like Jesus sees us? As beings who have gotten ourselves into a lot of trouble. And that it's either he makes a sacrifice or we die. And Jesus chooses the sacrifice, in this case of himself, but for Lawrence it means that he has to build a fence. And inside of that, inside of that fence, there needs to be a much smaller enclosure called a boma. So wild animals get used to their territorial ranges. And for some reason, this happens with many different species. When we reintroduce them into new spaces, we keep them in one spot for a while. So in Yellowstone, you could still hike to the spots where when they reintroduced the wolves, there's a smaller enclosure where they first kept them there. Pardon me one moment. So, he employed most of the town to get this done. Because two things have to occur. They have to, one, cut down every tree within the line of the fence. Because elephants know how to do this. What they will do is, I don't want to touch that hot wire. So what we'll do is we'll push the tree over, and it will knock into the fence. It will short it out once this thing is done, and we can just walk out, which these elephants had learned. In fact, the matriarch, family groups of elephants are run by the oldest female, had learned to actually take her tusk, so the large tooth that grows out, and the least conductive part of her body, wrap that wire around it and pull it, just so that it would snap. And so they needed to eliminate any trees. Not a small feat in the wilderness. So they started cutting down tree after tree after tree, going along the lines, hiring tons of people who were going to come along the line and stretch out these big, thick wires that were going to conduct the electricity through, that's going to tell the animals, hey, stay on this side of the fence. It took them time. It took them tremendous amount of effort. Finally, the outside fence was electrified. They had brought in people who were going to take care of the new unit that was going to electrify the fence, produce the electricity in the area. It was well protected, those sorts of things. The boma was built with that nice big space in which they could hang out and get used to their new space. The reason that you do that is because wild animals, for some reason, if we were just to take them, transplant them, and put them into one spot, they would start to walk back home. How they know where that is or directions to those sorts of things, I do not know. But oftentimes it does occur. So they call for the inspector. Someone from the government has to come and ensure that this park and these facilities are that are proper elephant, accommodations by law. This is a thing we don't really experience much in America, but that's okay. They have to be properly graded and all these sorts of things. Here's the issue. When Lawrence went to look at the boma, the main body of the fence was on the outside of the poles. Now, for anyone who has built a fence, do you know which side the main body of your fence should be on? The inside of the poles. Because otherwise, you don't have the strength of the various poles that are going to hold your fence in place. All that's holding the main body of the chain links and various things like that is just going to be whatever bracketing or wire or things are holding them onto the poles, significantly weaker. And you don't want things that are significantly weaker with elephants, potentially extremely dangerous animals. So they worked as fast as they could. The man from the government was coming to inspect the boma. He was on his way. Luckily, they lived out in the boonies, so it took people a little bit of time, and they had to work just constantly, tons of people tearing down this fence that they had worked so hard for to put it back up in the proper direction. Finally, they did just as they could see the cloud that was rising up from the car coming. This beautiful space, water. There were dammed up places in the river that were created pools, grasslands, beautiful trees, stands of acacia, all sorts of other animals that the elephants could explore, that he had prepared for them a beautiful place in which to live. Again, sounds a little familiar. And that's why I'm glad I have Jesus constantly ringing in my ear as I have things that I'm listening to or reading of various things, that I have a God who has prepared for me and you a beautiful place, a home. These lessons don't occur in any particular order, by the way, but it is a good thing as we are reminded of this, these simple realities of our wonderful God, who, as much as this man loves and cares about these elephants, must love and care about you and I so much more. For I go to prepare a place for you. In our Father's house there are many, some of you say mansions. I like the translation that says rooms. I live in my Father's house, and there is a place for me there. a room with my name. I'm sorry. There's something in my throat. Oh, sorry. I'm going to try not to choke too much while I'm up here. A room with my name on it is in heaven, where my Father has built a place for me, where Jesus has provided a place for me, for you too. I don't think it's an irony that Jesus was a carpenter while he was here. A beautiful place to live. The man from the government came, looked at the place, inspected it all, checked the generators, all these sorts of things. He says, "You're good to go." He says, "Great, because the elephants turned out were already on their way." See, a problem had occurred where the owners, who had been very eager to remove these elephants from their property, had said, ready or not, they're coming. We can't have them anymore. Apparently they had broken through some different areas again, which resulted in the matriarch of that herd being killed. And off they went in this enormous trailer. If you ever get a chance to look at this piece of machinery, it's interesting to see how we thought, yeah, let's pump some elephants into this thing and see how it goes. Very solid, not like you see at the beginning of Dumbo, where the train is coming down the track. It's not like that at all. In fact, there is only one really big hatch at the top and big gates in the back that allow for the removal of the animals, who do not go in conscious. They have to dart them. So, unlike seeing a horse or a sheep or a goat or a llama or any of those sorts of things that you can coerce into getting in there, there is no coercion that will persuade an elephant to step into this metal cage. The top, of course, is to give them reversal drugs so they'll wake up from the, stupor that we put them in to get them transported. And it started to rain. Not the rain like we have. And I think only few parts of America experience this sort of rain. Real African rain, where you feel the drops hit you, and there is no doubt as to what is occurring. You could not see through the rain. Rain producing mud, which made a big problem because in order for the elephants, which by the way cannot do what? Jump. You had to take a ditch and dig it down so the back wheels of the trailer go boom. And the base level is flat with it. So they can just walk out onto dry land. That was turning into a pond. The trailer, anyone ever backed up a trailer? Yeah. Your humanity is greatly tried in those moments. Hard enough when it's raining and all these different sorts of things, and now the elephants have to have a slight sedation, just standard procedure that helps them stay calm as they are exiting this machine. So the vet has to climb up on top of the giant metal contraption, open up that hatch, and use a blow dart or a syringe on a stick to kind of just give them a little something to help them calm down. They're awake now down there, and the hatch opens, and it's very dark and quiet except for all of the rain, until a trunk shoots out and attempts to grab onto the ankle of the vet. You know what happens if an elephant gets a hold of you and brings it down into the group where the rest of the very angry pachyderms are? It's not pretty. Jelly may be the closest thing. Hostility these animals had. Remember, they had just experienced one of them had died just recently, and then they put them all onto a truck and shipped them off to a place they didn't know, and then here the hatch was opening up, and here was the guy that had, nailed them with that pointy thing before. They were going to get him. Luckily, they finally get everything parked, backed up, animals settle down a little bit, and the doors swing open to where there is no gap between them and the boma. And nothing happens. And nothing happens, and the rain pours down. And then out comes a snake-like object with a trunk, sniffing out in front of them. They have a tremendous sense of smell. We think of them mainly as using their nose to pick up things, which, by the way, that trunk can pick up things heavier than we. But they use them delicately to smell out, to feel. And out comes the oldest female. They called her Nana, which is what Lawrence had called his own grandmother. And out they came, one after the other, as they followed the new leader, out into the open. And there was Nana and Frankie. There was Mabula and Marula, little tinier elephants. There were several just pumping themselves out of this thing to the point where you felt like, how could we possibly have gotten this many elephants in this tiny little place? And yet there they were walking out. And they saw up ahead of them inside the boma, at the center, there was a stand of trees. And they quickly went right in there and disappeared. You wouldn't think it's possible, but many people who have worked out in the bush will tell you, experienced trackers and all sorts of things can tell you that sometimes the only way you know there is an elephant or a herd of them around you is that all of a sudden you rounded a corner or you pulled a bush back and there it was. Much like over here we have moose, right? Moose can move weirdly silently through the brush. Elephants, too, seem to be able just to melt their way out into the bush, trumpeting as they went on. The last thing, of course, that they did was Nana turned around at the back of the group, keeping everybody protected, flared out her ears, which is what they do when they're feeling threatened, really making herself seem big, trumpeting at the group of humans, and then ushering herself back in. They closed up the gates. Things were going okay. It was in the wee hours of the morning, so Lawrence, who was probably used to late nights and these sorts of things, had decided it's time to go to bed. He left a guard stationed there to make sure everything was going to be okay, and he went to sleep. Must not have been too long, because the sun had not yet risen when he hears his radio crackling to life. They called him Unkulu. Zulu's like a nickname, and to that it means grandfather, which is not a like, oh, look at the old man. It's a term of respect for him. They would say, Unkulu, the elephants, they have escaped. They had apparently melted their way in. And he said, well, quickly, I'll come. Drove as quickly as he could. The rain had died down significantly to the point it was almost gone. And there he saw his guard standing and telling him about how the elephants were doing fine. Then he saw them again. And he said, I heard a gun speak. A gun had gone off at some point. And I couldn't say where it was coming from. But they are gone. They had busted through the boma. Something had scared them, and they had just punched their way through this. Thousands of volts on this wire. It's not like what we deter horses with. Or, if you're ever a kid in a rural community, you dare each other to hold on to it, and then you dare a friend to wet his hand. I wouldn't know personally. They were gone, but here's the thing. The boma was inside of the larger area. Elephants, though, have an extreme speed that they can put on when they really want to. No one had seen exactly where they were going. It had been raining, so their tracks, even though they are, several thousand-pound animals, was not visible on the ground, even to well-experienced people. But they got into the truck and followed along in the direction of where their old home had been, figuring that the animals were likely just scared of something and just trying to get back from where they had come. They were in an unfamiliar area, and they came to the spot along the fence line where they had busted through the outer fence. Now there are elephants out in a rural farming community that had not seen elephants in the wild in a great while. See, Lawrence had to work really hard with the local communities to convince them that it was going to be perfectly safe to allow these giant animals to live inside of Tula Tula, because they weren't going to come out. Communities where elephants do interact with people, that they tend to eat crops, which they feel were a generous offering by us, similar to the deer. But imagine a deer that does not seem to be deterred by any sort of fence. Weighs, 10, 20 times what a deer does here. And they were out there. Lawrence's wife, who was French, had engaged in some exploration of trying to see if people in the community knew where things were, and would come to people and say, have you seen my elephants? To which the people who had never seen a French person before would do this. No. No elephants. Lawrence had called around for various people. Just being able to get a plane that was going to be able to search out the area was proving to be extremely difficult. But finally he had found a friend who had a bush plane, but it was only available for about 36 hours. It had some very urgent things that it had to do, that it could not be used for anything else other than that. 36 hours, a day and a half. That's all they had to find these elephants. Because not only did you have to locate them with the plane, you needed the plane or helicopter to dart them. Because most of the time they were off the beaten track. They weren't in places where you could get even a good four-wheel vehicle. They had a good thing. They had a good place with safety and love and care. And what did they do? They just ran away from it. They turned their back and off they went. Oh, we like sheep have gone astray. That we have had a good thing with God, and yet how often do we find ourselves just turning away? I can do this. I got this all on my own. That we just turn away from God and we feel like we could take care of things just fine. When in reality, the life apart from the good things God has prepared for us, the good things that He invites us into, the good way of life that He desires for us, a life apart from that is really destructive and dangerous for us, as though we have closed our eyes to all the things outside of our relationship with Him that could do us harm, that hurt us. Likewise, here's the issue. These elephants have a history of being destructive. So they do not have what many wildlife have, which is called the three-strike rule. So three-strike rule is they can engage in some sort of destructive property damage or things like that, and if it occurs 3 times, then we shoot them. Florida has a three-strike rule similar to this. Here is, though, the issue. They don't get a chance. It was either behave or that's it. Lawrence, though, calls the various government agencies and begs. He says, please, just give me this time. Give me this amount of time, and I know I can bring them back in. I know I can bring them home. Just give me this amount of time. And they begrudgingly allow it. But that does not mean that he does not periodically, as he is searching high and low all throughout the bush and along the roads and in rural communities, encounter various people who are ready to collect the bounty on the elephants. They were out there by themselves, alone, on the run. They had turned away from what was good for them and are now out in a very dangerous situation. Not only that, they can do a lot of harm out there, just as people apart from God can do a lot of harm to other people. We can be so destructive in our relationships when we are not right with love itself, God, when we have not built that as a foundation for our existence, for our way of living and following Jesus. We can do a lot of harm. They got lucky. See, the elephants had been sighted by the plane, which was running low on fuel, though, when it had seen them, so it had to turn back and fuel up again, which means they could just disappear again. Very frustrating. Here's the lucky part. There was a governmental game preserve not far away, and they managed to bust through that fence. On the inside, there was safety. Nobody had known this had occurred, though, until evening came, and some of the park rangers who worked at this particular reserve were sleeping, and something started happening to the thatched roof of their remote ranger station. See, it was made of straw-like material, and that looked pretty good to eat, it seemed, to the various elephants, who had somehow, by the way, split into two groups, at one point being 20 miles apart, and found each other again in this preserve. And he woke up to see what he had probably thought was a python or something coming down through this newly acquired hole in his roof, to come out and see here then is a group of very irritable elephants. There they were. Luckily, they had brought in some vets. They had known exactly where they were. These game rangers just decided, well, we're up anyway, and decided to stick with these elephants to ensure that they were going to get back home. And they get them darted. They rent again the giant machine that has the hydraulics and space and structural integrity to load in thousands upon thousands of pounds of elephant into it. They put them back in, and they bust them back to Tula Tula. And you know what they do this time? They put them back in the boma, because that's what they had. Only this time, Lawrence decided there was something different that had needed to occur. These animals, when they had encountered various people, had not acted the way normal wild elephants should. They were acting incredibly hostile towards various people, even people who knew what they were doing around them, and had warned him and said, these things are dangerous, and you need to get rid of them. The government called and said, if they get out again, that's it. Lawrence's plan was this. These animals had had such a difficult relationship with people, such hostility back and forth, and they didn't know how to behave right where they were supposed to be. So he was going to come and he was going to live there, outside of the boma. He got his four-wheel drive packed up with various food and things, and drove down to where he would be sleeping and talking to them, he and his head ranger, every day that he would spend time with them, teaching them that it was okay, that they could be friends, that they didn't have to be scared or angry or any of these sorts of things, that it was going to be all right. Again, familiar, right? That God sees us and he comes and he dwells among us. I love that text, that the Word became flesh and dwelled among us, right there at the beginning of John. That he doesn't dwell adjacent to us, above us, somewhere nearby. He can see us, we can't see him. It was there, among us, with us, together, right? Emmanuel, God with us. That he is there, among us. And that he desires a relationship with us. That not only was he present, he is present now. It's not that it was true, it is true. That he desires to be with us. And so Lawrence sat there day after day. An interesting thing had started at about 3 a.m., and almost exactly the same time, he would sense something was happening. Now, this is not entirely odd because elephants actually produce sounds that you're not aware that you're hearing all the time. They can produce what is called infrasound. And you ever wake up and you just know something's going on? For him, he would wake up at this hour, and at this point, the first time he had ever seen it, he woke up, looked, and there was Nana, right up against the fence, standing there. And he could see her. If you spend enough time with animals, you start to learn the subtleties of their body language, and you could see her tensing, as though she was preparing to endure a shock. And he didn't know what to do, except to walk up to her, not too close, and say, "This is your home now. There are good places for you here. This is a good space for you to be. You are safe here with me. That it's going to be okay, that I've got you. You don't need to go out there. If you go out there, they will shoot you." I don't think elephants speak English. I do get the impression that some animals of greater intelligence do seem to understand something about us in ways I don't know, and I'm sure God and I will have many hours of conversation on this someday. And she would loosen down when he would come up and talk to her. And I give him a lot of credit for not only being brave enough to stand there in front of an animal he's sure is going to bust through this electric fence. That if she was willing to bust through, thousands of volts of electricity, you think stepping on him was going to be an extra inconvenience that she would not be unwilling to endure? She would loosen up, turn around, and they would all go back into the center of the boma, back into their little forest. They would only really come out when it was time for feeding. They would get huge bales of alfalfa, and one ranger would stand on one side and start hoisting it over until the elephants started getting over too close to where he was. Then the other side had to do it for a while, because you couldn't be close enough where Nana or Frankie or one of the other big females could get a hold of you and bring you in, because it would be very dangerous for you. The 3 a.m.s kept happening. Most of us are asleep when they are. We don't experience anything that's really going on. But that would happen day after day. He would rise up and he would say, "It's okay. You're okay here with me. This is a safe place. This is your home. This is good for you to be here." And they would melt back in to the center. And one day, 3 a.m. or thereabouts, darkest it could be, Nana comes to the fence line, tensed up, and as soon as she saw Lawrence, instead of him having to say anything, as soon as he left his vehicle, she just loosened right up. And this time something odd happened. So it was many different wires If you've been to a zoo that has elephants, you see that it's not really like the way they enclose most other animals. There's these big, high tensile wires. And she took her trunk and snaked it over the hot wire, arching it so that it could avoid being shocked, and started stretching it out towards Lawrence, to which he then, not seeming to hear the words of warning his ranger was yelling at him, moved in closer to her and received a gooing. You think it's dry, is what people tell me who have dealt with elephants in close proximity, is you think it's going to be dry or like a dog's nose. It is not. That there was residue. Maybe that's the word. As she snuffled all around him, touched him, and then removed her trunk back in. This is an animal who just a few weeks prior would have grabbed him, dragged him over those electric fence wires, and stomped him to death. And yet now is developing a relationship of trust because he spent time with her. Time together. If we call ourselves people who desire to have a relationship with Jesus, I know of no relationship that can thrive without time. Time with Jesus. It is a healing and restorative action. And I think we do not do it enough. I know I don't. That if we want a relationship, it requires time. Who among you has a friend that you've never talked to? Or is married to somebody that you've never seen their face? Right? It takes proximity to develop those relationships. It takes trust, it takes time. That's what Jesus wants, I think, is time with us. And that promises us eternal time with Him. I mean, heaven is essentially that, right? In addition to the wonderful things that we get as a bonus, it is essentially eternal life with Jesus. That I get to spend with Him every day, all day. This went on a couple more times, and Nana started spending more and more time bringing her family outside of the forest that was inside the center of the boma, out into the open that was around the ring, sort of looked like a tire. And there she was, just loose and enjoying herself, bringing up pieces of alfalfa to her mouth, letting the babies play around, and she wasn't as angry anymore when she saw Lawrence. She was not getting up at 3 a.m. to attempt to escape anymore. And Lawrence said, as he looked over and saw her just enjoying her life, exactly as he had always hoped she would, that it was time. Various experts had told him, you need to keep elephants in a boma for this amount of time or this amount of time. Some people had said up to 2 years. Some people had said 6 weeks. He had said, well, the only way to really know was when they were comfortable and not busting through fences, when they were safe. And he went over to the gate, which was held down by a large beam that was made up of a eucalyptus tree. Nice straight beam of one that was acting as the lock, essentially. And they lifted it, and they let the gate drift open, and they went back to the car and sat there and watched as Nana looked, lifted up her trunk, which if you see an elephant much like this, that periscope, at smelling to investigate various things, and led her family. As she walked out, she looked over to where the car was parked and just led everybody out into the larger game preserve, out to explore the sweet grasses and the beautiful water that was there, the forest and the trees, to see the various other animals that lived nearby. They had learned to trust the one who wanted the best for them. They had learned to truly see that. Through time, sometimes through error, that they were pursued by the one who valued them. They were brought into a safe place through that. And now they live out there. If you were to go to Tula Tula today, you can see Nana. I don't know how old she is now. Pretty old, I think. And her family have expanded. There's many of them there now, living out in South Africa. They had expanded out into more places, providing jobs and different sorts of things for local people. Not only had they learned peace, they learned to teach it to others. And I'm going to finish with this. Marion called Lawrence again. She said, here's the issue. There is a Big Five hunting preserve, so some game reserves are used for hunting grounds. So if you pay an exorbitant amount of money, and for whatever reason you would seek to do this, I do not know, you could shoot an elephant. They're no good to eat, I'll tell you that. I don't know it off of experience. I just know there's no hoof there and they don't chew cud. So I just think it's good advice. Too smart to eat. So she said the rest of the herd had essentially been sold off for hunting. And there's only one elephant left. And she said it's either you or she's going to get sold. And an animal of this intelligence, most herd animals, regardless of their level of intellect, need companionship. Just as we were made as a herd animal. You may not know that. God made us with the desire of community. Right? The first thing I can really think of God saying that is not ideal in his creation is it's not good for man to be alone. He needs a community. He needs someone to be with, a partner, but also a larger amount of people. That's why we're part of a church, right? We need each other to look out for each other. And said she's very ill-mannered, a young female elephant, but there's no one left. That she's probably going insane from the loneliness, which actually can occur to these animals when they're not treated properly. She's seen the various other animals get shot for whatever that meant to an elephant, but certainly led to her being very hostile towards people. And he said, we'll take her. He didn't know how she was going to do with the other elephants. He didn't know what she was like. He didn't know how terrible she was behaved, and they took her in, same sort of situation. She had to go and live in the boma for a little while, and didn't need to be kept in as long because she had not learned the tricks of the trade as to how to bust through electric fencing and destroy gates and things like that. So she wasn't in there that long before they let her out. Showed great hostility towards vehicles, which meant they could not allow tourists into the game preserve, because what do you do when you have something that could legitimately destroy the vehicle of your people? I just don't think insurance, regardless of which country, feels that's an appropriate thing to absorb as a risk. And so they called her E.T., which is an abbreviation for the French word for terrible child. She was just ill-mannered, would charge people, would charge vehicles, would go out of her way to be unpleasant. And finally, she came to where the rest of the herd was. And they integrated her into the hierarchy, allowing her in. And a strange thing would occur. These elephants, who when they first came, were let out, would initially charge anybody who was coming along, including Lawrence, until he was able to shout to them, "It's me!" which they seemed to recognize. She would charge at vehicles. In fact, once Lawrence had not realized they were there until he had busted out of the bush into a clearing, and there was E.T. coming towards him. To which Frankie, one of the most ill-tempered previously of the elephants, had actually just walked in front of her and diverted the animal that was going to stomp him into the dust. Later on, actually, each time E.T. would charge, the two older females, Nana and Frankie, would actually just move to where they were about in front of her and take their trunk and just tap her on the forehead. Just a tap. And they said it would stop her as though she had been hit by a brick. See, for them, they were a community that was drawing her into a better place. Even though she had had her own issues. They're out there, and they're elephants, and I think God made his elephants and loves and cares about the various members of his creation immensely, but also is, as much as this tells me about how one guy can put forward so much effort to save this group of animals that seemed like they were just not worth the effort, it's so reminiscent to me of how much more God must love and care about me and you. I've done nothing that would make me worth the effort. Those elephants probably at least produced more tourism. I cannot bring to God more. I can't add to him. I can't make him wealthier. He just wants me, and he wanted me so much that he was willing to sacrifice himself to make me part of his kingdom. And that it helps me to remember that I don't need to run. I don't need to leave. I don't need to go somewhere else. Is that the presence and the relationship of God is enough. That this God who came into the world to make it possible for me to be part of his family, it also wants a daily interaction with me. There aren't that many people who want a daily interaction with me. Some days I am ill-tempered or selfish or narcissistic. And yet God still desires to come into my life and transform me and work with me, to spend time with me. And that if I believe that for me, of course I believe it for you, that Jesus wants to spend time with you. Not only does he love you, he likes you. And I just hope that as we build as people who internalize these things, these simple values of our relationship with Jesus, and we are transformed through our proximity and our absorption of who Christ is and of our time with him, that people would look years later and see, oh, this was a person who was really cranky. This was a person who needed a lot of help. And their time with Jesus transformed them, transformed the community they were a part of, transformed the families that they were in, transformed their relationships and their habits, everything, as they were in proximity to Jesus. We have had a bad run as a church over these past few months. And I hope that this story at least provided you with an opportunity to sit and rest for a moment on this God's wonderful day of rest, but that I hope that we continue to be a people who have open eyes to the wonderful lessons that God is trying to teach us through everything that we see. and know that He loves us, He wants to spend time with us, and that He can and will transform us. Us, you and I, us, all of us together, us, this community, us, this country, us, this world, us, this humanity. Let's pray. Lord Jesus, I pray that you would continue to help this place, this community, this body of yours to be a place of comfort and love. That we would be witnesses of your transformation, the things that you are doing in our hearts, the hearts of this community, and of the people we love. Lord, help us to have open eyes and ears to the wonderful lessons that you can teach us through the beautiful things around us. We thank you. Amen. Happy Sabbath, everyone.